Hi, how are you? We have gotten to third book from Leo Tolstoy, and it's Resurrection, which was published first in 1899. Resurrection is a totally different kind of book than War and Peace and Anna Karenina. And if you are going to read just one book from Tolstoy, start with War and Peace. I don't recommend you to start with Resurrection. It's a much tougher book, but if you read it, you may learn much more from human nature and from the conditions that were in those days in Russia and maybe on the other parts of the world too. Human life was not as precious as it is these days in the Western world. The story tells about the man, about Nehunov, who is from a wealthy family and lives a careless life, partying and gambling and so forth. And in his youth, he goes to visit his aunts that have this servant girl, this orphan, and there is some unfortunate happenings which end to pregnancy of this young girl, Katerina. And before knowing about this young man, Nehunov, continues his life, goes back to town and continues partying and gambling. And he never knows what happens to the girl. He forgets her altogether, although he thinks that he was very much in love with her that summer that he was in his aunt's estate. But fate brings them together again. And this Nehunov goes forward with his career and ends up being a juror in the trials. And one of these trials that he is a juror of, he realizes or observes that this same girl, this Katrina, is in trial for murder of one of her clients. And he learns that she actually got pregnant that summer, long time ago, and the baby that she carried possibly died, and she wasn't, of course, possible for her to get a decent job, decent servant positions after that, so she ends up in a brothel, being a prostitute. And now he is standing a trial, accused of a murder. And of course you can only imagine Russia in the 1800s, the punishments are quite harsh. So she is facing a possibility to hard labor in Siberia. But when Nehunov sits there and watches the trial and learns all these things about the woman that has happened, he realizes that this is actually his fault. If he would have done what he should have done, so fell in love with the girl, get married and so forth, she would be a respectable lady and had multiple children with him and not standing a trial of murder of a client, of a brothel. And that's the sort of resurrection part or awakening part. The awakening of Nehunov, of his conscience, of his realization how the world is. It's not just for the rich and privileged. But he actually has responsibility, or he wants to take that responsibility. And the book tells this was just like the start. After that, the book tells Nehunov and how he visits this Katerina lady in a prison where she waits to be moved to Siberia. She is, of course, sentenced from the crime. and thinks that there is something wrong with the process, and he tries to make it right, but nobody cares. Nobody actually cares. Even if there was a mistake, it's just one woman that is going to Siberia. Who cares? And he understands that, and he even goes to his influential relatives and people to ask them to make a plea to Tsar for the girl or for the lady, but they don't succeed, and his relatives don't care. And of course there is much talk about owning a land and who can like own servants, and is it right or wrong, and that's kind of embedded into this plot. Ne, visits the prison, and as he goes there, he tells the stories of the prisoners that are sentenced there, and the impossible situation that they probably didn't know, or they didn't know why they were sentenced in prison. They maybe didn't have their identification papers, or they were in the wrong part of the country in the wrong time, or there just was no reason. And the dreadful things that most women had their children with them in the prison. Even though the conditions were harsh, they didn't have a choice. If they were sentenced to the prison, they didn't have any place to leave their children, to anyone to care, and they were there without any reason, without a trial, without any rights. Nehudov even thinks that he tries to make things right by marrying this Katerina lady now that she has been sentenced to prison, and if that would help her to get out sooner, or if it would allow him to stay with her wherever she goes. But the lady declines, of course. Or, of course, I can imagine. But that kind of sacrifice seems too much, and it is described that she is a little bit suspicious of why Nehudov wants to do this kind of absurd thing. Absurd for her, because she is a lower class person than Nehudov is. Then there is a description of the process that the prisoners were moved to Siberia to their sentenced work. And there are bits that are based on true events, and it's said on the book very clearly. And there are descriptions of how many people and how they died during that transit. So first they went to train, and some of the people died in a train. There was, for example, a woman giving a birth in a train, and she was a prisoner. And then there were some men that had a heat stroke after they have gone to the next stop with the train, and then they started to walk. And they walked for days. And there were small children, and then there was a discussion who can carry them so they are not left behind. And that's a very cruel story. This is a cruel story in a whole, and it makes us think what is the value of human life, and how we treat each other, and how in this book they treat each other, and how many people have died in vain and for the crimes they did not commit. But there is a glimpse of hope, of course, and that's like in all Tolstoy's books. This is a tough book, but it's written just so that it's not so tough as the title and the description leads you believe. There is always some small glimmer of hope And even in the end, these prisoners think that they live their lives. Those are the conditions that God gave them, and they live in those conditions. And some of them are very idealistic, and they continue living according to those ideals. And that's quite, I do not know, is it accurate? I doubt it. But it makes this book very, very much easier to read. So if you want to touch on some kind of reality and know about history, this is all these books, especially this one, is a lesson of history. And don't get me wrong, it's a good book as itself. It's not like War and Peace, it's not like Anna Karenina, it's not a similar book, but it's a book of human life, it's a book of misfortune, it's a book of suffering, and it's book of awakening, and the way that it is described when Nehunov sitting in his bench and looking down at Katerina in the trial is really like touched by God, and he understands that what have I done, and what can I do to make this right? How can I dedicate my life to try to make these kind of things right? That's kind of moving, and I think that it describes very well about all this total transition, it describes well this total change of heart, this realization that what life is about and what world is about, and the fact that God is watching. Like I said in the beginning, if you're going to read just one book, don't start with this. But if you read the others, then and you want to know, you don't want to be comfortable all the time, but you want to know, then read this. I do often, like I did simultaneously, I was reading this book, and then I was reading something a little bit lighter. And advise you to do that if you have the time, or if you have that kind of heart that it gets stuck in a sad description. If you are in that part when you are going to, or when you are supposed to go to sleep, then read first this and then something lighter, and you get much information, but you sleep better. So this was about Leo Tolstoy's Resurrection. Is the latest book of Leo Tolstoy that I read, and maybe the last at this point. I may well go back reading Tolstoy again, but now I change to other books. But I hope you have a great day, and I see you soon with the next book. Goodbye.